Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone still coming in. Welcome. I'm really excited you made it out here at 10:30. It's very, very nice. I see some faces in the crowd of people who I know aren't getting up at that time usually, so I appreciate that. Thank you for coming by. Today I want to talk about designing Compose APIs or building Compose APIs. And originally this talk was titled 5 Easy Steps to Design a Compose API. Then it turned out I really didn't have 5 steps, more like 4, and then I worked on it more, and then I had like 10, and then they weren't really steps, and they weren't easy. So it's just like, okay, we're doing something Compose APIs. And essentially this is like me talking a bit about stuff I learned since I joined Google 1.5 years ago, and I've been working on Jetpack Compose. So my name is Jossi Wolf. I'm a software engineer at Google, and I work on Jetpack Compose, specifically foundation libraries. Yeah, we're going to take a little deep dive, some history, and some fun, not so fun stories. I want to preface this by saying there is no one way to design APIs. There's no singular way of doing this, and I don't want to claim, hey, this is the perfect way to do this. I really don't think it is. And this is not the only way that Google works. This is how I work personally, and maybe how some others on the team work, and then other people work differently. So just keep that in mind. Now, let's actually dive into this whole story. So I feel like I've talked about this story a few times. We used to have an API in Jetpack Compose material that was called Swipeable. And essentially, it used to be an API that allowed you to build components that can be dragged or swiped between a set of discrete states. Sounds complicated. Let's take a look at an example. So for example, this is the API that powered modal bottom sheets, navigation drawers, more components like swipe to dismiss. Anywhere where, for example, a bottom sheet, you would drag that up, and once you let go, it settles at the closest state. So either it would fully expand or it would hide again. And same for a navigation drawer or an item that you can kind of swipe to dismiss. The API looked like this. It was essentially a modifier in combination with a state, a swipeable state. It was a swipeable modifier, and you would give it the state, and you would give it anchor points. So these anchor points would tell swipeable, hey, at this position, so for example, 0f is the hidden state. And then we have expanded at, for example, minus 500. Minus 500 because this is where we're offsetting the bottom sheet to. We're placing it, and then we're offsetting it towards the top because it usually starts at hidden. Now, these anchor points, you give swipeable to say this is where we want to settle once the user lets go. And cool, sounds great, right? Why are we even in a talk that talks about this story? Yes, of course, as with everything that you build at some point, you realize, hey, our use cases grow. And there were some issues, just a few, some here and there, just a few with a few +1 votes. And we were like, okay, obviously we have to do something about this. And we tried to fix a bunch of these bugs. Well, we tried to fix all of them, but it became apparent that working around them was really, really hard. And that was because of the current API design of modifier that's swipeable. So what we were doing is we were passing the anchors to this modifier. Now this modifier gets created in composition, in the phase that's called composition. So essentially when we execute this composable, before layout and before we do measure and before we draw. And that also means if we create this in composition, we need to have the data for these anchors in composition. And that also means that we would require a recomposition when these anchors change. Sounds like an issue? Maybe, maybe not. Well, for example, looking at modal bottom sheet layouts anchors, these anchors were defined based on the sheet height and the full container parent height. Now, if we look at the phases of Jetpack Compose, some of you may have seen this before. It doesn't matter to understand this way in depth. The point here is we first do composition, and then we do layout, which is this orange block there, where we do measurement and then placement. So measurement, we want to find out how big is everything, and then placement, we find out where are we going to put things. And then finally, we draw. Now, layout is where we get, well, the size of components. And this phase is happening after composition. So if we need the sheet height, and we need the sheet height to define the anchors, but the anchors need to be passed in composition, this means that we first have to do one composition pass where we essentially don't know what the anchors are, and then we do layout, then we calculate the anchors, and then we can recompose to pass the new anchors to modifier.swipeable. Now that's not great because it essentially makes some components slower. It also makes them less predictable because suddenly they require 2 passes to work, and it's much harder to wait for 2 passes than to just say, do a thing, and now we're done. Because you don't necessarily know if the future work will be happening, when it'll be happening. It makes testability hard. So we decided, hey, let's kind of go and redesign this. We had a couple of use cases, right? We had bottom sheets, backdrop scaffold. I think even swipe to dismiss is actually using layout-dependent anchors. And for these, we wanted to optimize for these use cases. So this is the whole kind of like background of like how we started working on this. Now, the first question when building an API is always, what do you even want to build? And this is surprisingly hard to answer. In our case, we were kind of lucky because we had some sort of predefined definition, which is very nice, because swipeable existed before. So we wanted to have an API for components that may be dragged between anchors, well, the discrete states, and that supports layout-dependent anchors. Right. So I'm sure all of you, or most of you, are familiar with just building things and being like, hey, let's just try to do a thing. Let's see where we get. This is what we did. Let's call this new modifier new swipeable. Very creative, great naming. And let's give it an onDelta because we want to have a thing where we receive any draggable deltas because we want to be able to drag it between things. Maybe we would even have a compute target method, which simplifies things, and then configure anchors. But this is quite a lot for one API to do. Let's separate this. Let's go and actually separate this. Even looking at the slide before where we had the entire definition on one slide, it was a lot to read, right? And maybe that's not the most optimal design process, but if you put your problem statement on a slide and it's too much to read, you're doing too much. So we're breaking this down. We're saying we want to have an API for components that can be dragged between anchors, which is already encompassing a lot of concepts like dragging and anchors, and the settling part, and finding the closest anchor. And then we also want to have support for layout-dependent anchors. Now, the important point here is really to make sure that you break things down into subproblems, and break things down into subcomponents and building blocks until you've kind of like reached the lowest level. Because it's so easy to kind of get caught up in trying to make one big component. I guess back in the Vue days or activity days, like 10 years ago, we were seeing this with like huge main activities, right? Things like that. Another important point with Compose APIs is consistency. For example, let's take a look at the new swipeable modifier here. It currently takes, in this form, in this imaginary API form that we just kind of like wrote out, takes a onDelta lambda, and let's say that gets a float, and you would do something with that lambda, you would do something with that float, and keep a state, and maybe move your component across the screen. Consistency with other components is really, really important when designing an API, because you want to make it as easy as possible for developers and really everyone who uses your code, that could be your coworkers, to understand what your code does, what your API does. So maybe we wouldn't be taking an onDelta, we would actually look at what are we doing across our other APIs. And we would discover we're usually using a state holder for these kinds of things. It could be that on delta is sufficient, but in our case, having a state is actually a lot more consistent with kind of like these more complex use cases. So we've taken a kind of like more complex problem statement, we've broken it down into two things, and we have two imaginary-ish APIs. Let's take a look at this problem statement that we said before is sort of still very complex. It still encompasses a lot of different things. And let's break this down even more. So we have some conveniently highlighted things here already. Dragging, we want to enable some dragging on component. So in compose words that is more accurate words, that would mean receiving pointer input and accepting pointer input deltas, taking these and then doing something with them, being able to move the component across the screen. It's really not that creative. I'm not sure why I wrote support anchors. We want to support anchors. And the important point here is we don't necessarily want to support layout-dependent anchors with this. We don't explicitly go and move that responsibility in here. We just want to be able to have this concept of anchor points where we settle at the closest anchors. Yeah. So the question is always then, how do you even build this? Like, what should the API look like? So we've kind of like broken this down. We have receiving pointer input and accepting pointer input deltas and moving to the closest anchor when the gesture is finished. Now, why this? Well, these are broken down by how we can actually implement this. So for example, receiving pointer input, how would we do that? How would that look in practice? Would we want to have a modifier, which we kind of like saw in the earlier stages early on, or would we maybe want to have a composable? And for the other things, we can quite clearly say this is something that does some operations, it takes data, it transforms that data, and then moves to the closest anchor when the gesture is finished. We want to have a state holder. Let's start out by defining the state holder, because that's maybe a tiny bit easier. So we're starting out by outlining and just saying, this is roughly what we want. We want it to have something that lets us accept a drag delta, and then we want it to have a method that lets us move to the closest anchor, maybe with an animation, make it fancy. So we said this is a state holder, great. And looking at the receiving pointer input part is where we have to decide a bit more between, do we actually want a modifier, do we want a composable? There are essentially, for anything that lets you receive some input on a composable in a hierarchy, there are two options, right? Modifier or a composable component or a layout. Now, we've already said we really just only want to receive pointer input deltas. And this already gives us a hint that having a kind of custom layout, having a kind of custom component, maybe isn't that helpful. And we can really see that by writing this out. If we use this API, if we ask developers to use this API, or if you just look at the code, is it clear to understand what happens if you wrap this with anchor draggable? What exactly is the intended behavior? And how would this work? Which box does it apply to? Does it just apply to the entire container? Or what are the semantics? Whereas if we, for example, experiment with a modifier and we say, hey, how about we take this modifier, and we just apply it to one box, things become a lot easier, things become more clear to understand. So in Compose, you will usually see either a modifier or a composable in combination with a state holder. So a state holder, very useful for expressing and reusing state-related mechanisms and logic, like moving to the closest anchor, or, well, holding the state, holding the current dragging state. And then you either have a modifier which lets you influence a node's layout or draw phase, the semantics, for example, for accessibility, or receive pointer input and read modifier locals. Whereas a composable is usually used as a reusable block for layouts. So, for example, row or column, right? Or box, very, very classic cases for that, or a button, a theme component. Now, we can just outline these, we can just put these side by side. We're saying, hey, if we have a modifier and this layout, really what feels right. We went with a modifier. Now, a fun question, a fun problem that, this just disappeared? No? Okay, just me. A fun problem that developers often face, and that is much more pronounced for us in Compose, is naming. Picking a name is really, really hard, and we all know developers are the best ever at naming and love spending time on naming and picking a really good name. And it's really easy to say, hey, let's not bike shed and let's not spend too much time on naming. But it turns out that naming is quite important. Why? Because you want your API to be as discoverable as possible. Say your user is in the IDE, and your user here could be your coworker, or anyone who uses your library or your code. Say they're typing code, and they're trying to do a thing, and they're like, I want to be able to drag a component across the screen. Maybe they type modifier.drag just to see what comes up with autocomplete, and maybe they will see a good suggestion that they think fits. If they don't think of, if it doesn't have a really good name, a really discoverable name, and a name that makes it really easy to understand from the get-go what is the expectation for this API, it will be much less discoverable, and it'll be much harder to use. So spending some time on naming is very important. In our case, we had swipeable previously, and then we had a ton of names in the mix, but essentially it came down to swipeable, anchor draggable, and anchorable or anchored. We said swipeable was sort of too opinionated and inaccurate because what really is a swipe, which is a very philosophical question, was not very accurate. And anchorable, anchored, really not that descriptive. It just tells you something with anchors, but is it draggable? Is it swipeable? How would you know what the actual action that the user can perform with it is? So we decided to settle on anchored draggable. Now, I think I've kind of touched on this before, but a really hard question that's usually asked in combination with what is our actual problem statement, but then after you build stuff out, you should ask yourself this again. What are the actual core parts of the API? Do I really need all of this? Do I really need all of these fancy concepts? We'll see some examples for that in a second. Because it turns out that if you just, forget to remove stuff, it's really hard to remove it later. Introducing an API right now, or introducing some code, I'm sure you all have seen the temporary bug fixes from 10 years ago, where somebody went, I'm just going to fix this later. And that's exactly why you really need to think about the actual core parts of the APIs. We're going to get back to some examples of that in just a bit. Another point I want to just explain a bit more from the Compose side, and that might be really interesting if you're building your own design system, is where does the API actually live? Layering is really a part of defining the core responsibilities. Maybe in your design system, you would have this kind of more opinionated layer that's actually expressing your design system, and then a more foundational layer where you don't have theming defaults or things like that. In Compose, we have the same setup, right? We have UI, which is kind of the very, very basic, and of course, below that, we have runtime and compiler things. And then we have foundation, which are ready-to-use components. And then we have material, which are really these opinionated components seem to look like a certain thing already and all fit a consistent theme. Now, swipeable is actually really interesting because it used to live in material. And some developers had asked us for a foundation API because they did not want to depend on material, and they were building their own design system. We discovered that actually, after renaming this from swipeable to anchor draggable, this aligns much more with our foundation principles. And yeah, why not just move it? The point here is, if it doesn't need to live at this kind of like very opinionated layer that you might have in your design system, in your code base as well, if you can make things more generic, that's usually a good thing. Things being more basic and less opinionated is really, really good because it means that you can build more things more easily and have more flexible APIs. This becomes apparent, for example, when looking at things like defaults. So what we ended up doing here is we have anchor draggable and foundation, and we actually decided not to have these defaults that we used to have at the material layer. There are a ton of reasons, but the point is you can even split out the responsibilities of your component across different modules. You could, for example, have these defaults at your design system layer, and then you could have your actual kind of like core component at the more generic, or less opinionated layer. I also want to make a point about iterating. I think this is something I've seen throughout my career in a lot of places, but I've just learned and learned again how much iteration and iterating on things is components on the mind, is important. Building MVPs and keeping them internal is a way that we do this in the Compose team usually. So we'll build something, and maybe if we're not entirely sure about the API surface yet, we'll keep it internal for the time being, and then we'll make it public a while later. This is really, really good because it gives us some more space to experiment and to think about things a bit more. The first versions of the things that you build, especially in kind of like API design, will usually not be great, and that's completely fine. And that's why I want to just go to some of the examples of changes we made. So this is one of the first prototypes I found somewhere in like a paste from roughly 1.5 years ago, I want to say. And uses some of the old API surface. I just want to talk about some brief individual point. For example, looking at the offset, exposing a value as state in Java Compose is very tempting because state is this great tool that lets you publish observable values and gives you all of those nice things. But then it really limits the API. For example, it means that users will always have to do swipestate.offset.value, or always have to do my offset is swipestate is delegated by swipestate.offset. And it just creates this very inflexible API. It ties you to a certain object and to a certain type that you really don't need. Using a float type directly means we can still use state under the hood. We can still get all of those nice things of observability, but we don't have to build it into the contract. And it makes us a lot more flexible, changing the API later if we decided to, and makes the code a lot easier to use for users. There's an interesting point in using existing building blocks, because usually it's really, really good to use existing building blocks. And for example, map would be a great example of that. Map is something that most developers probably know, and it kind of is fairly understandable if you spend some time looking at why are we taking a map of T and float. But then map is, for our use case, sort of inefficient. So we always want to walk the line between, are we actually gaining anything by using a known building block here, or do we really just want to have our own type. For example, draggable anchors. This gives us a lot of API flexibility later on, again, if we, say, decide to change out the implementation from a map to something that's more efficient, and we can change a lot of the internal representation without breaking users' APIs. We also have the thresholds here, which used to be exposed as a kind of interface. And this is a case where custom types can add more complexity than needed, and this is the case where we could actually break things down. Essentially, the thresholds can also be expressed as a lambda. And with some documentation, this means it's a lot less complex to understand once you look at it, just because lambdas are a very known building block, a very known concept to most developers. Similarly, for handle overflow, this actually introduces its sort of own concept. It makes swipe state have this concept of overflow, which you need to learn. In Jetpack Compose Foundation, we actually have a very similar concept to what this overflow thing would do, which is overscroll. So when you when you have a scrollable container, you reach a bound, it stretches. And really, Swipeable was doing something very, very similar. And this is a great example of how it makes sense to reuse these existing concepts because they are much more familiar to users. So, maintaining code and APIs is really, really expensive. And I want to show some more of the progression of how we went from Swipeable to Swipeable v2, which we're kind of like at now. So we ended up having this state holder and then a modifier that lets us detect drag gestures and dispatch those deltas to the Swipeable v2 state holder. And then we also said earlier on that we wanted to support layout-dependent anchors. So let's get back to that. We decided to introduce this API called modifier.swipeAnchors, and it took a bunch of stuff. Took possible states, which is sort of confusing, and we'll get to removing these in a second. And the point is we ended up with 3 APIs at some point that were, actually, were they public? They were sort of public. We went from having a first prototype sometime early-ish last year to actually uploading the internal MVP, getting a ton of reviews and opinions from people, to having a first internal version where we specifically did not want to commit to the public API surface yet, introducing some more concepts, so iterating, and then migrating some of our own internal components to the new API. Ton of bug fixes, because it turns out when you build stuff, things break. And finally, we decided on the name and made it public very, very recently. So where we're at now is we decided to rename Swipeable v2, which is a great name, to Anchor Draggable. So this became Anchor Draggable state. And similarly, the modifier would become Anchor Draggable. Looks a lot more simple now compared to when we think back to the really first slide's modifier.swipeable. And this is actually the entire implementation, which is very nice because it is very simple, and it means that users can implement their own modifier.anchorDraggable if they just wanted to. So remember the modifier.swipeAnchors. Turns out this was actually a really, really complicated concept. This is a modifier that would let you configure for layout-dependent anchors, obtain the layout size, and then update the anchors. And first on, we had this anchors changed callback. We actually decided, do you know what, we can remove this. And after that, we were able to remove the possible states field, which is nice. And the reason we had this API was that we had a method on anchor draggable state that was called update anchors. But it had this really weird contract that was, you should really only call this before placement. You should make sure that all the data is available at a certain time, which isn't a great developer experience. you should always encourage the happy path, which technically having this modifier and an inaccessible API did, but not in a very great way, because always no API is the best API. We're actually able to change the update anchors contract from call this at a very specific time only, please, or things will go bad, to making it safe to be called at any time. And that actually let us remove the modifier.swipe anchors because we were able to kind of like simplify a lot, make things a lot more safe, and ended up with a sort of nice API where we now essentially have a anchor draggable state and a modifier.anchor draggable that you can use and an update anchors method. And I'm sure we will simplify this more in the future. We have a bunch of things in mind. There are some learnings. Just finishing with API design is actually really, really hard. I learned a lot, and there are so many things to learn. If you do want to learn more and read a very comprehensive document on all of this, search Compose Component API Guidelines, which is written by the team. And this is like an entire document on making decisions for designing APIs in Compose, building components. And that's it. I still have the 5 easy steps there, but they're not really easy. So thank you.